The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar. The title of today's webinar is Acceptance Testing in Agile. What does it mean to you? And today's webinar presenter is Fran O'Hara. If you have any questions for Fran, please type them into the questions field on your control panel. You can do so at any point during the course of the webinar, and at the end of the webinar I will ask these questions to Fran directly. This webinar, a recording of this webinar as well as the webinar slides will be available on the EuroSTAR Conference's website after the webinar. And you can join the conversation on Twitter at #ESComms, and you can also connect with us at @ESComms, and you can also connect with today's presenter, Fran O'Hara, at @OharaFran. And now, without further ado, let me hand you over to today's presenter, Fran. Hello, Fran.
Hello, Dara.
Hi.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining the webinar. There's just a few of details of what we do, my contact details there as well, the website. Basically, the main thing I'm involved in these days is supporting companies to transform to Agile using XP, Scrum, and also Lean with Kanban, and testing, both pure testing like ISTQB, but also the crossover then between testing and Agile. And that's really where this webinar comes from. It's kind of based on a talk I gave at the Swedish Association of Software Testing there a few weeks ago, and with a similar kind of title. And these are the topics I'm going to talk about. First of all, very briefly, just a bit of a talk about a couple of slides about acceptance testing in traditional sequential life cycles, plan-driven approach, and what traditionally we've looked at as an interpretation of acceptance testing and its different forms, for example, with the V model. And then I want to get on to acceptance testing in Agile, because one of the motivations for this talk is really the kind of the variation I've seen in many different organizations on how people interpret the phrase acceptance testing, and in fact confusion as well around the term acceptance testing. So I just wanted to try and give my view of what I think is maybe a clear view of the interpretation and how it can differ and how it should differ. But so people are just aware and not making, let's say, the wrong assumptions around acceptance testing. And then a few conclusions then at the end. So first of all, acceptance testing in traditional sequential life cycles. So I could have shown the waterfall, but this is the V model, which is slightly better than the waterfall from a test perspective. At least we've broken up the testing into different test levels. And here we have unit test, integration test, system test, and UAT. Again, we could have shown more test levels. And of course, there's static testing you could do, but of course the V model is more concerned with dynamic testing. And acceptance testing then in sequential life cycles, when we talk about acceptance testing, we often use the phrase user acceptance testing. As we see here, user acceptance testing will be done by users, our customers. If I'm an IT department, it will be done by the business side, the business users, and they'll be testing against their own user requirements. Of course, as opposed to system tests, which will be testing against system requirements as defined in something like a functional spec. So that's most commonly, what you see in V model is user acceptance testing. And it really is a key form of validation. Validation is checking that we're building the right system, as opposed to verification, which is checking that we're building the system right. And most other forms of testing, like unit and integration and most system tests, are verification activities, as is static testing, most static tests. But UAT is a final form of validation. Have we got the right system for our users? Now, of course, it's very late to be finding out that we have the wrong system for our users, not what they wanted. So that's one of the weaknesses, I guess, of sequential life cycles, and it's where Agile changes things, gives us much more feedback at a much earlier point in relation to whether we're building the right thing for our customers. Now there are variations, of course, on acceptance testing in traditional life cycles. I've just talked there about UAT, typically done by users, which is really a confidence builder. Often they're not expecting to find too many problems. It's a final rubber stamp, make sure it fits the way the business process works, that type of thing. But there are additional forms of acceptance testing that we come across in traditional life cycles. There's alpha and beta testing, which is when we're dealing with a product and we're developing a product, say, for a marketplace. So we don't have a set of users we can just call upon to do UAT. We have a market out there. So in that case, we would potentially do field testing or beta testing and maybe some alpha testing on our sites beforehand. So beta testing would typically be done by some beta customers on our behalf, give us feedback on our product, its features, find some bugs for us, that type of thing. So it's a form of acceptance testing that you come across in product development organizations. OAT, operational acceptance testing, another variation that you sometimes come across. Typically, you know, in an IT department, you'd often have an ops team or an infrastructure team who may perform some technical type testing. They're responsible for maintaining the live systems, production systems. They might perform some checking of security procedures, backup facilities, maintenance procedures, that type of thing. Performance in the context of the infrastructure within which the application is going to be operating. So that is a form of testing you sometimes come across as well under the broad heading of acceptance testing. And then, of course, there's contract and regulation acceptance testing. Now, contract relates to when there's a supplier-customer relationship and there's a contract put in place stating the requirements, the delivery timescales, the pricing, and also the acceptance criteria. And those acceptance criteria, of course, would include the testing that will have to take place before which the customer will pay the supplier for the delivered software. Again, the supplier would do a lot of the system tests and so on, and the customer would do a final kind of contractual acceptance test and then pay the supplier on the basis of those tests passing. Regulation acceptance testing would be where there are certain government or safety or legal or some industry standards or regulations that have to be checked against, and again that may be a form of acceptance testing that takes place. So these are just examples. It's not exhaustive, but there's some examples of the variation in the definition or approach to acceptance testing in sequential life cycles. And the ISTQB definition of acceptance testing points you to user acceptance testing, which is this definition here that you'll see at the bottom of the slide. Again, fairly general definition of UAT or acceptance testing. Moving now on to Agile, I just want to talk a little bit about, you know, what happens to, let's say, UAT in Agile, but also what the term acceptance testing is changed as such to mean in Agile. It has a different interpretation in Agile, and just to kind of clarify or even show some examples, just so we can kind of have a basis for discussion around acceptance testing in Agile. First of all, a few key concepts around Agile and what's different and how this is going to impact on how we look at acceptance. First of all, in traditional life cycles, we fix our scope, our requirements. We have a baseline set of requirements, and then we develop a plan whereby we estimate the budget, the resources, and the timeline it's going to take us to deliver all of those requirements in one hit. So this is very much a plan-driven approach, and as many of you probably would have experienced in the past with sequential life cycles, and indeed currently maybe, what often suffers is quality. If we deliver all that scope on budget and on time, often to be able to do that, we have to cut back on testing, for example. It's a thing that gets squeezed at the end of the life cycle. So that's one of the kind of the problem aspects of sequential life cycles. Alternatively, we could preserve quality, increase the budget, or slip the time scale, but it tends to be, in my experience, quality is often the thing that suffers because it's maybe the least transparent, the least obvious thing, and yeah, that's an issue. In Agile, there's a total change of mindset to all of this. We fix our budget, we fix our resources, we fix our schedules, typically by time boxing and having a fixed time at which we're going to do a release. And what we will do is we will deliver the scope that we've developed in that timescale with that budget. It's very much value driven because at any point in time we can change our focus, our priorities based on what will deliver the most value right now to our customers. So it's very much about embracing change. And our variable, our estimate here is the scope. We may plan a release over a series of iterations, or sprints is the phrase that we use in Scrum. What kind of scope we're going to deliver in that time frame. And, but obviously that may vary. Either we may deliver more or less, or a changed scope based on the customer giving us feedback along the way and based on maybe changing priorities. But the key thing at the bottom here is that we are going to preserve quality. We are going to build quality in as we go, rather than try and test it in at the end. So therefore testing is now much more an integral part of our development rather than a phase at the end. So that's a key difference. And because we're going to be fixing our time and doing time boxing, it opens up other possibilities in relation to our acceptance approach, as we'll talk about. So waterfall is this sequential life cycle where testing is at the end, plan-driven and squeezed. Agile is about particularly taking a XP or Scrum-based approach where we have iterations or sprints. We have a periodicity for each of those sprints. For example, they may be 2-week or 3-week sprints, and we go through our activities within that sprint of sprint planning, daily stand-ups, and so on to develop a set of user stories or whatever scope we have applied to that sprint, and then do a demo to our product owners or customer representatives at the end, and then do a retrospective to improve the process. That's very much a Scrum-based iteration or sprint. And we don't change our scope during that sprint. Change can occur in terms of between sprints. We can decide to change what we had previously planned to put into the second sprint before we start it. We're embracing different priorities. We're embracing feedback from our customers based on the demos and so on. But the other key thing about this representation is that we have potentially releasable product software at the end of each of the sprints. Now, potentially releasable, in my experience, there's not too many organizations that are at that point where they could potentially actually release product after a sprint. Typically, there's a certain amount of end-game activities, as they're called, that need to be put in place before you can go for an actual release. But it's a question of degree, as I'm going to talk about later. This particular slide doesn't show where we're releasing. We could, as I say, be releasing after each sprint, but more often I find that a number of sprints are required to create a sufficient viable scope, minimal marketable feature, whatever you want to call it, that we actually want to release to our customer and go through a release process with. And in that case, of course, let's say we decide to release after sprint 3 here. At that point, we may do a user acceptance test. Our customer, rather, may do a user acceptance test at that point. And that may be the agreement we have with them. Alternatively, there's an option for them to do a user acceptance test at the end of each of these sprints if they're more involved with us in terms of our iterations of the sprints and giving us feedback along the way, which is obviously a better approach. Okay, so this slide here is about what, again, I often see in organizations to varying degrees. It's a lot of focus, a lot of, let's say, the description I just gave there of Scrum, and the various ceremonies that take place within Scrum, like sprint planning and demos and so on, stand-ups. That's where a lot of the focus goes. And it's where we develop our software in these sprints or iterations. But what often happens prior to all of this, some people call it sprint 0, some people just call it a planning phase. It's where we get our initial product backlog together. Again, this product backlog has at least to have sufficient stories in it to allow us to start working in our first sprint or 2. But ideally has enough scope defined, not necessarily to the lowest level of granularity. We may still have epics in there rather than stories to allow us to do some release planning. So we can see maybe over a series of sprints roughly what scope we plan at this stage to deliver to our client and discuss that with our client. We accept that that may change. and based on the feedback from the client, we may get different priorities coming along midway and so on based on feedback. And similarly, our architects may have been used to defining a big architecture up front in detail, but obviously in Agile we want to minimize that. We want to maybe have an architectural vision. We want to allow, if there are multiple teams, to work within some kind of common architecture, but we want to do the minimum there to allow us to start working and delivering business value. So that's one aspect of the upfront. The test planning I'll come back to as well, because it's something we need to think about. When we're thinking about what kind of scope we want to release, we need to start thinking about our test strategy. We need to start thinking about what kind of risks there are, what kind of tests we have to do, how we're going to define our acceptance tests as part of an overall set of tests, and we need to start deciding where we're going to do all that testing. Is it all going to be done in each sprint, so it's potentially releasable at the end of each sprint, or are certain tests going to be deferred to later sprints? And then we may have this endgame phase at the end, or a hardening sprint, or whatever you want to call it at the end before we do a release, where we do certain activities that are difficult to do within sprints and that we push to the end, like system integration testing, like performance testing, like a UAT or beta test. Now the graduation between waterfall and Agile that I have depicted at the bottom there shows that, you know, if we go back to full-blown phases, we're back to a sequential life cycle. Whereas if we have more and more of these activities integrated within the iterations or sprints, the more agile we become, the more working software we have available at the end of sprints, rather than we have stored up a lot of risk to the end of our project where we do our integration, do our performance, and so on. So we need to be doing as much as possible as early as possible. Now, you may say, well, we can't do a performance test of our system until we have a system. What you can do is performance testing of stories, of the scope of functionality in a sprint along the way each time, and do regression from a performance point of view as well. So we can be doing performance testing all along and then do a final performance test at the end. Now, that may not be the most efficient if you look at it purely from the point of view of performance testing, but from the point of view of Agile and Lean, we're not looking at optimizing any particular activity. We're looking at optimizing it at a system level, and therefore having working software available as we go is a much better strategy to achieve that end-to-end system view and cycle time reduction and so on. So doing as much of this as possible within sprints is key, and getting as much as possible to the right-hand side here in terms of being agile and not storing up this risk to the end of our projects. And the same applies to UAT, or beta testing, whatever form of, let's say, traditional acceptance testing we may want to do. If we can do that at the end of each sprint, great, even within sprints. It's even better, rather than storing all that up to the end and not getting a final customer feedback until just prior to release point over multiple sprints. Okay, let's look a little bit then about from the point of view of testing then and the test strategy. This is what I sometimes see in organizations as they move to Agile from traditional sequential life cycles. Example A is the worst scenario, where people just haven't got the idea that testing should be integrated with development, and it's still a separate handover type thing, and testing works a sprint behind development. Again, this is not Agile. It's very much based on handovers and sequential activities. Example B, scenario B, is better. At least the testing is happening within sprints. However, it's still not fully agile, because it's like what we have here is a mini waterfall. There is coding taking place, design and coding, development taking place, and then testing is taking place at the end of the sprint. And we're trying to fix all the bugs in time before we hit the end of the sprint and do our demo to our customer representative. So this suffers from the same problem that waterfall as our sequential life cycles suffer. It's testing is going to get squeezed at the end and so on, and we're not building quality in as we go to the same degree. What we want is scenario 3. We want to have testing happening throughout the sprint. Now, sometimes Agile teams struggle to figure out, well, how do we actually do this? How do we achieve this? And I think the two key points that help achieve scenario C is, first of all, having user stories that are granular enough. I've seen some organizations, their user stories are spanning sprints, or there's only 1 or 2 stories per sprint allocated to a team. That's too big. You need to have stories that are smaller, that are you're able to allocate maybe 5 to 10 or even more stories to a team to complete within a sprint. That then allows them to start staggering their development of these stories. So you don't start developing all 10 stories in parallel and they all become available the last day of the sprint for testing. What you do is you stagger the development. You work on 2 or 3 stories right from the start, but you don't start working on the others. So you get them to completion. That's depicted in the task board on the right-hand side here. I'm just showing 2 stories, 2 rows, and their associated tasks. But obviously you prioritize your stories and you start working from the top down. And you implement the code for that first story, that second story. You're able to test it within 2 days, within 3 days, that type of thing, rather than leaving it all to the end. And as you finish a story, of course, you take down the next story. So you're progressing and completing stories as you go through the sprint, including all of the testing that's associated with those stories. So granular stories at the right level of granularity is key to allowing tests to take place throughout the sprints and for testing to be totally integrated. The other one, of course, is test-driven. To have a test-driven approach, both at the unit level, which is often where we talk about TDD, test-driven development, but also at the acceptance level. So right at the start, one of the first activities we do when we take a story and its associated acceptance criteria is to start defining the acceptance tests associated with that. Those acceptance tests form part of the definition of the requirement. They expand on the requirement. Each test case is a model of the behavior that we require associated with that story. And developers use those test cases to clarify and enhance and add more detail to the understanding of the story. And those tests, just the acceptance criteria of the story and the tests that come from that, come from conversations between the team and the product owner or customer representative. So that's a key element in relation to integrating testing throughout. So acceptance testing in Agile, now we have a new phrase, really, a new interpretation of acceptance testing. There is traditional UAT that we just spoke about and how that might happen relative to release or ideally much earlier and distributed. But there is also the idea that acceptance testing takes on a broader interpretation in Agile. And I think it started with XP and so on, and customer-based or acceptance-based tests. This is the definition you get from the Agile Alliance website. Near the bottom there it says also known as functional test, acceptance test, customer test, story-based testing based on user stories. They may be automated, these tests, and they are a key form of functional specification, as I mentioned. They expand on the requirements. So, that's the definition. Acceptance test is a formal description of the behavior of a software product, generally expressed as an example of a user scenario. So the difference, I guess, is that these are the outside-in business-focused tests based on the stories and so on. That's just generally how it's interpreted. And it's not the same as UAT necessarily, as we'll see. This is Brian Mark's testing quadrants, and this is referred to quite a lot in the industry as a good kind of thinking template in relation to the kind of testing we need to do in Agile and the characteristics of those different types of tests we have to do, be they automated or manual. They're grouped into these 4 quadrants. You've got business-facing tests versus technology-facing. You've got evaluating the product versus supporting the team. So your Q1 tests are your developer low-level tests, unit tests, ideally automated using test-driven development, and some low-level integration tests or component tests, which are quadrant 1 type tests. Quadrant 2, I often see sometimes quadrant 2 being called acceptance tests, or I see a subset of quadrant 2 being called acceptance tests, i.e. story tests being equated to acceptance tests. So the interpretation of the phrase acceptance testing often varies, but generally quadrant 2 is closely linked with acceptance type testing in Agile. So that includes story-based tests, maybe examples, if you're using maybe specification by example, or behavior-driven development using given, when, then structures. They often drive the testing that you might do from the point of view of what the customer wants, business facing. Ideally these are automated as well, so we can use them for regression purposes. They are tested right up front based on our stories. They may be tests at a higher level than stories maybe as well, maybe testing a broader set of functionality, maybe testing features, maybe testing epics, which look at maybe higher level than just story level. The stories can be quite granular, so we need to see the big picture here as well. Quadrant 3 is the manual kind of exploratory testing course, which Agile teams rely heavily on, which is a very productive form of testing. Finds a large number of faults in a short space of time. And I think when it's been equated or compared to structured-based testing, I think it's been shown to be, a number of times more productive in terms of faults found per hour. So it's a very valuable kind of technique to use as part of your overall test strategy. Now, what do you call this? Acceptance testing or not? Again, often it isn't. It's just an extra type of testing you might do, maybe based on scenarios as well. Scenarios may be covered. Usability testing often is described here in Quadrant 3 as well. And again, there's a lot to usability testing, and it's an often underrated risk area usability, and we need to consider how we're going to test this in relation to getting real users to perform tasks and so on, and to monitor how they get on and to really tease out usability issues. UAT, of course, may be a formal test that our customer wants to do in Quadrant 3. And they want to take it and run a formal user acceptance test before they actually release it into their environment. That may be the scenario you're in. Alpha-beta testing, again, maybe where you've got a product. So that's similar to what I described in traditional, the UAT and the alpha-beta there. And you can see, therefore, if I'm going to define acceptance testing as story-based tests, it's very different to UAT. And then you've got your non-functional type stuff in Quadrant 4. Your performance, your technical security, your stability, your backup recovery, ILITY type testing, reliability, and so on. And again, they may be kind of tests that we need. So you can see across these 4 quadrants that we need to consider. We don't have to do all these types of tests. We only have to do them when you consider them if there are risks with our system that need to be mitigated with these types of tests. But it's a good thinking tool to think of in terms of Agile testing, because Agile testing, we often think simply in terms of, we need to do some automated unit tests, TDD, and we need to do some acceptance tests that are based on stories. That's all we need to do. But obviously that's very rarely the case that that's all we have to do. Okay, so here's one interpretation of the quadrants, for an organization, that you can interpret acceptance tests to be Q2 type tests. So all the tests that I defined there, or talked about there in Q2, we could all call them collectively acceptance tests. But I often see even confusion here, because many people interpret the acceptance tests as stories, whereas other people within the same organization are interpreting acceptance tests in a broader way to cover feature-based testing and so on. So we need to be very clear in any particular context, in any particular organization, what we actually mean by acceptance testing. I'd refer you as well to the book on Agile testing by Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory, pretty much the Bible on Agile testing. And again, they refer to Brian Mark's testing quadrants, and they give a good kind of treatise on each of those quadrants and expand on them and so on, give details. But here's a quote from their book. Some people use the term acceptance test to describe Q2 tests, and as I say, I come across that quite commonly, or even a subset of Q2 tests. But we believe that acceptance tests encompass a broader range of tests, include Q3 and Q4, and verify aspects such as usability, performance, and so on. So here again is another interpretation, a much, much broader interpretation of acceptance tests. And it's one I actually like, because it means that we don't have to have a narrow definition and then describe all the other tests we need. What we need to do is define what acceptance testing means in our context, and it could include all of these other areas, these risk areas such as usability, performance, and so on. But again, it's up to you in your context, in your organization, to define what it means to you. Okay, how does it relate to automation? Well, here's one depiction of the automation pyramid based on Mike Cohn. The principle here, of course, in Agile is that we push automation down to the lower level in Agile, because there's a much, much higher return on investment from lower level tests compared to user interface based testing. where we're driving through the browser, GUI, and so on. So we drive it down to the unit level. This is our foundation of automation. They're much quicker to write, they're much quicker to run, easier to maintain, and so on. So our developers using TDD at the unit level will write automated unit tests as they write their code, and we have this bank of regression tests that we run every time we do a build. Of our continuous integration. Selenium, maybe we're automating at the feature level, the workflow level, but we should be reserving these type of tests for, just key type of tests that we want to cover rather than it being the mainstay. The interesting one in Agile is the middle layer, the API layer, where we're thinking of higher level tests based on stories, for example, that I just described there in the Q2, and but we don't implement those tests as tests that drive the browser. We directly hook up those test cases to the functionality in the system that implements them, through the APIs, through the services, if we've got a SOA architecture, whatever framework or fixtures we can come up with that actually put that in place. They will have a higher return on investment than GUI-based tests, which tend to be more brittle and require more maintenance and so on. So there's a place for all these types of automation. And of course there's a place for manual testing like exploratory, as I mentioned. Depending on your definition of acceptance testing, they may be the middle tier as this diagram depicts. However, if your definition of acceptance testing was the one from the previous slide, it of course would include all of the tests above the unit level here. It would include the API testing, the GUI testing, and the manual tests as well, like exploratory. So again, it depends on your definition of your context. Here's a diagram, depiction of the interaction, the types of testing and the interaction between the different roles within the team as well, from Lisa Crispin, that I like. Again, this slide is kind of showing the Q2 customer story-based tests. You create a story that's done by the product owner. The color code shows who's doing it. You write the Q2 tests. The product owner may be doing that, supported by the tester. Or what I often see is that the tester within teams takes a dominant role within this and maybe gets the product owner to review what they've done. But then a key one is that the tester expands these tests. Now again, what does that expansion mean? It depends again on your context, how broad the kind of testing that you need to do, the risk that you need to mitigate. The developer is starting to think about how to code. Maybe the developer and tester get together to automate those Q2 tests, like the API level testing I talked about, using some kind of framework. Collaboration is the key word here. You're collaborating with the product owner and the tester. You're collaborating with the developer, between the developer and the tester. The developer is doing their unit level TDD. Maybe they're pairing up with the tester. The tester is also doing exploratory testing, and the customer may do a user acceptance test based on the user stories, or they may just be happy with a demo and observing the results of the Q2 test run by the tester. So there are various scenarios that can occur. But again, I just want to highlight from the point of view of acceptance testing that acceptance testing, could be the Q2 tests, the expansion of those Q2 tests, the exploratory tests, but also there could be a lot more testing that you might have to do as part of your definition of acceptance testing. That might include, for example, feature type testing. Again, it depends what you mean by expansion here. The non-functional testing, etc., etc. So this testing shows that it's kind of driven by the story, but again, my point is not to be blinkered by that in terms of your test approach and your definition of testing. From the point of view of emphasizing or trying to highlight that point about not being blinkered by a testing of a story, if we just test stories, we're just testing the leaves of a tree, basically. We need to remember the context within which that particular leaf is. We need to remember the tree and the branches and how it all hangs together effectively. Some organizations use story maps as a way to kind of help store and highlight and orient the various user stories, how they relate to each other at different levels of granularity, from epic or feature down to stories and so on. And it kind of helps from a testing point of view, because rather than just testing each story in isolation as an isolated unit, we're also thinking about how we test the interaction between all of these. So maintaining the big picture, workflows, scenarios, feature testing, all of that I think is very important And again, you just have to be careful with your definition of acceptance testing, that you don't maybe exclude or push your Agile teams in a certain direction by an inappropriate definition of acceptance testing, or not having a consistent interpretation of it in your organization based on the strategy you need to have based on the risks. So now that you've identified, let's say, the risks with your system, with your product, the kind of testing you need to do, given that you're now Agile, you also need to define when you're going to do those different types of tests. Now, this just shows, like in Sprint 1, we've got development and testing. That testing may be acceptance testing, which is based on stories. If we take a narrow definition here of acceptance testing, it's the automated unit testing as well as the automated acceptance testing, ideally both using a test-driven approach. It's also manual exploratory. That's very much what you might call the bread and butter testing that you see in Agile teams in sprints. But my point here is that you have all these other types of tests, whether they're part of your definition of acceptance testing or not, or what are just additional types of tests you may need to do if you have risks that need to be mitigated. You may have to do these types of tests: feature tests, performance tests, end-to-end scenario tests, system integration tests, and so on. The point is, where are you going to do them? As I mentioned earlier, you want to keep pushing so that you're evolving to fully working software. There's more and more of the testing, or more and more parts of the testing being done earlier and earlier within sprints, rather than leaving all of these types of tests to the end as an end-game activity. So it's a question of degree, and it's a question of improving it over time. It often needs investment, and it's something that doesn't happen overnight, but it's something we should strive towards, to be more and more agile in our approach. This comes from Janet Gregory, and just showing how your context, if you're dealing with a large organization with large projects, you may have multiple teams working on the same project, working on streams of features and so on, and they may all have their testing and their acceptance testing and so on that they do within each of those sprints, but you've got to now consider the interaction and the integration and coordination of testing across these teams as well. So you may have a good continuous integration approach where the teams, you're integrating across teams on a daily basis. Sometimes I've seen that is not in place, and you can only integrate at the end of sprints if these sprints are synchronized with the same cadence. So again, it depends on your context, your level effectively of your depth of Agile implementation, where you are at any point in time, and how you need to improve or focus your testing. The full regression here may be, you might have to do ongoing performance regression. There may be manual testing that needs to be done from a regression point of view if you haven't been able to automate some tests yet. But again, we're trying to do as much as possible within the sprint. So that may need a kind of a test-focused Scrum type meetings that happen on an ongoing basis across teams to help coordinate. What we're trying to do again is get as much of the testing within the sprints and done as early as possible, rather than leave it all to the end game activity. So again, all of this affects this context with large systems and multiple teams is going to affect our test strategy, and therefore it's going to affect our definition of acceptance testing within the context of that test strategy. Okay. So, just in conclusion, therefore, that the message is simple. It's don't take a textbook definition of acceptance testing and think that it's going to work for you. You need to consider your context. You need to consider the risks in your situation, the life cycle you're using, your organizational context, the context of the domain you're working in, whether it's regulated, type of technology you're dealing with. All of these are maybe going to affect your test strategy, and then within that, your definition of acceptance testing, and what do you need UAT as well as acceptance testing, what your definition of acceptance testing includes. Is it all Q2, Q3, Q4 type tests, etc.? So actually it doesn't matter what the definition of acceptance testing is, as long as it's consistent and appropriate in your context. So agree on the definition, within your organization, disseminate it to your people so that you have a good testing approach, a good agile testing approach that considers the incremental aspects of agile as well as the agile aspects of being able to potentially release at the end of sprints. Okay, that was pretty much the presentation of the slides. So I'll hand over to Darren now. I think he's got a couple of slides to go through, and then maybe answer some questions. Hopefully we have some questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Fran. And like Fran said there, we're opening the floor now to your questions. So if you have any questions, please just type them into the control panel. So while you can type your questions in the control panel, let me bring your attention to our webinar archive, where you can get access to almost 50 on-demand software testing webinars. And if you join our community, you'll get access to 600 software testing presentations, 50 topical webinars, over 40 videos, podcasts, ebooks, and more. This year's conference is taking place at the Swedish Exhibition and Congress Center in Gothenburg, Sweden, from the 4th to the 7th of November. So we hope to see you there. And finally, our super early bird discount is only available till the 31st of May, which is this Friday. So you have a few more days left to avail of this discount, which can be up to 430 euros. So now let me just get my questions here for you now, Fran.
Okay.
Okay, the first question I have here is from Barbara Murdoch. Is each quadrant inside of each sprint?
I guess that's what I was alluding to by, which slide was it? The slide entitled Sprints and Testing Strategy, where I was saying that you first have to take the quadrants and look at them and look at the types of testing within them and go, which of these apply to us? Are there some of these that we can delete? We don't need them because the associated risk is not present in our product, so we don't have to worry about that type of testing. So that's the first step. You create your own version of the testing quadrants. There may be tests that you have to add into those quadrants that aren't in the standard one because in your context there's a particular risk. So you first create your own quadrants. Then there's a second step, which is to decide where you're going to do that type of testing as you go from sprint to sprint. Now this relates to the situation where you're not releasing after every sprint, or you're not into a flow-based approach like Kanban, you know, where you're potentially delivering a continuous flow of business value, you know, on a much more ongoing basis. If you're dealing with a time-boxed approach like Scrum, then the question is, are you releasing after every sprint? If you're releasing after every sprint, then it has to be fully working software for that release. Therefore, you'd have to do all of the testing that are in your interpretation of the quadrants. If you're releasing after a number of sprints, then, and this is the most common situation I come across, okay, you are ideally doing all the testing within the sprints. But practically speaking, that often is not the case. There are often constraints, be they environment constraints, be they resource constraints, be they technology constraints, whatever, that stop you from doing all of the testing within the sprint. So there are certain types of tests that get pushed to the end game activity, get pushed to the final hardening sprint just prior to a release, whereby a release is taking place after a number of sprints. So the answer really is that it depends on your context, but in general, you want to do as much as possible within sprints, but there are certain types of testing that are often, at least initially, left till the end. And my point is to, okay, you may have to start like that, but to continuously strive and improve to do more and more of the testing within the sprints. So even pulling aspects of those tests into sprints at an earlier stage, rather than storing the risk up to the end, will make you more agile and will give you the benefits associated with having working software along the way rather than storing up the risk till the end. Okay.
The next question I have is from Moshin Ali. Can you please explain why you include security testing in tool section Q4?
Well, I guess it's included in there as security testing is an odd one. Security testing has both a functional and a non-functional or technical aspect to it. If you have functional security requirements like access levels, certain user privileges can access certain functions and features and not others, and there's password protections and all of that type of thing to prevent certain users accessing data or features they shouldn't access. That's all functional requirements. So that can all be tested as part of Quadrant 2 in terms of the functionality, in terms of the stories. So a lot of stories will relate to those to security. But technical security, is very much something that is done by technical security experts as such, often using tools that are going to scan the interface of the system, looking for vulnerabilities and ports, and or it's maybe going to be tools that can be scanned over the code, looking for vulnerabilities there. So it's not an area that I have experience in, but it's certainly an area that is part of the the more technical type of testing that is kind of lumped together under the term non-functional or technical testing, and is put into Quadrant 4 there, and often involves the use of tools to support that type of testing. Okay.
The next question I have here is from an ADIB, Khalid. If we don't flow with Agile process, should we still need acceptance testing?
I don't understand the question really. If we don't flow with Agile process, do we still need acceptance? Well, flow, if you're talking about flow in the context of like Lean and Kanban and delivery, the flow, trying to get a flow of business value, if that's the context of the question, then we need to be doing all the kind of testing we need to do to have working software associated with each of the small batches of functionality we're delivering. And therefore we need to do acceptance testing or whatever testing we have defined as part of our strategy. Okay. Now, if you're talking about in the context of UAT, if you're delivering functionality, that's something you on an ongoing basis. It's something that you're flowing at. It's something that you agree with your customer. When do they want to do, let's say, a customer or a user acceptance test? If your customer is, for example, in a separate organization to you. But I'm not sure I understood the question, Sean, so I'm not sure if I've answered this correctly, I'm afraid. Okay.
The next question is from a Talmon Ben Kanan. What is the cost of UAT in terms of percentage of project costs?
Traditional sequential life cycles, the UAT is often done by your customer rather than your resources. So if you check an IT department, you may have an internal customer that, let's say, like in a bank, who are the business users of the IT systems. The IT department is producing software, it's doing its testing, system testing, unit testing, and so on. And roughly, UAT in that context would typically be about, 15–20% of the overall test cost for that banking organization. Obviously, it may vary. It may be greater, it may be less in a certain context. In one organization, I saw an awful lot of UAT taking place, a much higher percentage, but it was because of historical issues with the IT department and the quality of software they were delivering. So the business side would beefed up their UAT to find more bugs because they weren't getting good enough quality from the development organization and system testing that the development organization were performing. So it depends on the context again what the percentage will be. In Agile, again, it's going to depend on your context. Like UAT in Agile, if you have the same situation, an IT department and UAT being performed by the business users, it may happen more frequently because you may get a UAT happening at the end of each sprint. They may not deploy that software at the end of each sprint, but you've been able to get validation that what you've done within the sprint is meeting your business users' needs. then again, each of those UATs will be a small UAT rather than one big UAT. So it adds up to a similar percentage from my experience. But I don't have data to support that because it's so varied, depending on one situation to another. How much testing needs to take place from a user acceptance point of view. And this is as opposed to acceptance testing as I've defined it, or the variations of the definition of acceptance testing in Agile in general. Yeah. So really it just depends on the context. Okay.
The next question is from a Margarita Lundholm. What about considering sprint demos as a type of AT?
Well, first of all, sprint demos, again, it depends how, if you're defining acceptance testing as a kind of user acceptance testing, then, and if your product owner is representing the users and customers, and those users and customers don't need to do their own formal UAT, that's often the case, then the product owner can decide that a combination of the demo and the higher level story-based acceptance tests that they oversee will be sufficient, and that you don't need anything else. So in that case, again, it depends on the level of quality, the situation you're in. What is good enough software? How rigorous does the testing have to be? How high a quality level is required? In an intranet site, internal software, a demo would be perfectly adequate. Even without a lot of rigorous acceptance testing. So, whereas in another situation, a demo would be totally inadequate. You would need to be able to point to acceptance tests based on stories, those being expanded by test competencies within the teams, along with the demos. But in general, a lot of it depends on the collaboration that takes place between the product owner and the Agile team, and how much the product owner gets involved in the higher level acceptance type testing based on stories, for example, and either directing that or at least reviewing that. And again, it's a confidence thing. If the product owner is happy with that type of testing and is happy based on participating in a demo at the end of each sprint, then that may be perfectly adequate. One key point I would make about demos is that they shouldn't be a polished kind of walkthrough by the team. It really should be a hands-on exercise whereby the product owner or indeed other kind of customer representatives are able to really try out the software, really interact with it, so that you really are looking for feedback. So again, part of it depends on how effective those demos are and how that interplays with the need for validation activities on the part of the product owner or customer. Okay.
The next question I have for you, Fran, is how do we incorporate the principles of risk-based testing into our Agile acceptance methodologies?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have seen a couple of presentations on trying to integrate risk-based testing as we know it in traditional development, which is whereby you actually do a risk identification exercise, list all the risks based on requirements, for example, analyze those risks in terms of their impact and likelihood, put them into spreadsheets, and then design tests against those risks and show coverage, and which is your traditional type of approach. And I've seen people try and do that in an Agile context, but in my experience, it doesn't work very well because of the fact that Agile is much more dynamic than that. The requirements are coming along on a constant basis, they're changing on a constant basis, therefore the risks are changing on a constant basis. Therefore, your documentation is going to become a burden to try and keep it updated and maintained and all your traceability and so on. So in my experience, the best way to do it is very much, adopting the Agile principle of you only document what you need to document, and documentation in general becomes a record of a conversation rather than something that replaces a conversation. So the conversation should be between the product owner, for example, and the team, particularly if you've got test competencies within that team, about the risks and the nature of those risks. Discuss them. They are discussed. They are on the table when you do backlog grooming sessions. You're talking about stories. You're starting to highlight risks. When you do sprint planning sessions and you're doing joint design and you're thinking about how you're going to test these stories, you're thinking about talking about risks. So that risk pervades your conversations and your language. And therefore the tests that you create are based on that knowledge of risk. Maybe not in a formal, documented, systematic way like it would have been with traditional development, but yet in a way that risk actively drives the testing that you do. So it's a bit less quantifiable, it's a bit less formal, but yet it ensures that as a team, you are covering the risks because you are discussing them. Like, just because something isn't written down doesn't mean it isn't going to get done from a testing perspective. That's the whole point in Agile. The stories are lightweight. You have to have conversations about them and come up with the acceptance criteria, come up with the acceptance type tests based on those criteria and the detail that gets drawn out from conversations. And one of the things that gets drawn out from conversations is risk. Okay?
Okay, and that last question there I forgot to mention came from Oliver McGibbon. This question now comes from Manoj Kumar. What are the major differences in practicing the BDD and ATDD automation methodology?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess part of it relates to just the nature of the way the requirements are documented, the fact that in BDD it's going to be expanded in terms of scenarios using the structure of given, when, then. So given something is in place, when this happens, then this will occur, this will be the result, and that directly drives the tests. I guess from a high-level point of view, it tries to keep the language very much in a way that can be understood by the different stakeholders, by the business stakeholders and the technical stakeholders, and uses those types of structures to help you do that. And those scenarios then are directly driving the tests that you're going to come up with. No, I guess that there's a little bit more detail to it, but I don't have the detail to hand here at the moment as well. But fundamentally, they're driving testing from the business or outside-in point of view. And again, ideally, you're automating them. Like acceptance test-driven development is very much taking the stories and writing acceptance tests and automating those acceptance tests right up front based on the stories. Whereas BDD is going to take those other constructs like scenarios and use them to help drive the testing that you're going to do and keep it as much as possible in a language, a domain-specific language that all the stakeholders are going to be able to understand as well, using frameworks like Cucumber and so on. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Fran. I don't think we're going to take any more questions as we seem to run over the hour mark. So I just want to thank you for today's webinar and thank all of our attendees. We have also got 2 more webinars taking place this week. The first is tomorrow at 2 p.m. We have a webinar entitled 10 Great but Now Overlooked Tools with Graham Thomas. And on Wednesday, we have another webinar called Let Test Automation Play the Role It Deserves with Ruud Tunison. The webinar is now over. Thank you all again. Goodbye.
Thank you.
The organizer has